Want to remove blocks to prosperity from your life? Do it with the best in the business, Catherine Ponder, a 30-minute meditation to help you open to prosperity. Go to hightimelinebooks.com to get yours today. Welcome to the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast. Thomas Miller, Robert Glasscock, and Tiffany.
Hi, Thomas and Robert. I love the podcast. I was wondering what would it look like in someone's chart if they were controlling, like what planets in what houses, what aspects. If you guys could cover that, that'd be great. Thanks.
Thank you, Tiffany, for yet another great question. I have to take a minute here, Thomas, just to thank the listeners in general. We've got the best listeners of any podcast going. Everybody is so intelligent. They ask really great questions. They're thinking, they want to go deep, and I really appreciate it. You know, this question about controlling is fascinating. We all have controlling aspects somewhere in our charts. So think about what control means, and there are various ways that can show. First of all, Capricorn and Saturn, if they're prominent in the chart, and the other one is Pluto and Scorpio. So those are the two main indicators, and you begin to look if Pluto or Saturn are in hard aspects, for example, the innate urge is there to control the matters ruled by the planet that Saturn or Pluto hard aspects. So if Saturn square Mars, for example, Mars rules two different houses in the natal horoscope, where Aries is on the cusp and where Scorpio is on the cusp. So in those house matters, the person will instinctively want to be in control. But there are other manifestations of this in the mutable signs. For example, the extreme example is bipolarity, or people who are not necessarily bipolar, but who gaslight. It's a form of control. I didn't say that. I didn't mean that. You heard me wrong. All of that kind of blaming the other person. So you can see controlling tendencies through the mutable signs as well. But primarily it's Pluto, which is totally unconscious until a person begins to study their horoscope and think about Pluto and in the house position and the sign position and what aspect it makes, then you can make Pluto conscious. But Pluto rising, for example, is a classic indicator, and control doesn't necessarily have to be negative. I've known plenty of people who are hugely successful with Pluto rising, but they absolutely are in control. And it's a sort of, and they're not mean, they're not bullies at all, but they, by George, are focused on themselves and usually their business. So wherever you have Scorpio on the cusp or Capricorn on the cusp, by nature, those house matters will be house matters that everybody will instinctively want to be in control of. Where you find Saturn by house or Pluto by house, the person will tend to instinctively want to be in control of those house matters as well. Pluto, rules power, but it's totally unconscious unless you are aware of it. So it operates, Pluto and Scorpio both rule obsessive compulsive behaviors, and we all have these in our charts somewhere. Doesn't mean that you're not necessarily an obsessive compulsive medically, but to some degree you may be. And the other key here is angularity. There are two places really that if you have Pluto or Saturn or Capricorn or Scorpio angular, then the control tendencies will tend to be up front. The other place to look is the 6th and 12th houses. The 6th house, yes, it rules work. Yes, it rules health and occupation and all of that. But as you know, I call that house, the 6th house, the house of psychological self-integration. And I've written a little book about it. It's on Amazon. But that house tells you how a person puts themselves together. In other words, the evolution from birth at the first house all the way through the first, second, third, fourth, and fifth houses. By the time you get to the 6th house, The sixth house sign and the planets in it and so on will tell you a great deal about how a person integrates themselves or doesn't. And if you see Pluto or Saturn in the sixth, or you have Scorpio or Capricorn on the sixth, that is another indication of the need to feel in control. And once again, like everything else in astrology, everything has a positive and a negative side. The big key with control is for the person to understand and realize fully you cannot control another person. The only person you can control is yourself. Trying to control other people is a projection outwardly of this inner need to control yourself, but it's unconscious. And so people who want to escape responsibility for controlling themselves and what they say and what they do and how they behave, they will project that need to control out on other people and try to control them. You see what I mean?
Yes, I do see what you mean. I have several things I'd like to pick apart on this. First of all, you mentioned Saturn and Capricorn, Pluto and Scorpio. Could I add Virgo in there?
Sure. It's one of those mutable signs.
Well, I'm working through that somewhat right now, in fact, and I'm seeing it. And just, not that we're labeling here. I mean, we're pointing out. She asked a question, where do I look in the chart to see this? And we know that a typical Virgo characteristic is if things are not in order, then there can be a reaching out. Let's say a positive reaching out. Could say lashing out, but that's when the Virgo tendency is shaken to its core, right? Things are not in order here, and I don't know where to go. Boom, out, right? So that could be another one I think that could come up.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Okay.
Virgo is very critical and it loves to argue, which is all a part of its critical nature. It's an analytical sign. So it's constantly, unconsciously, constantly picking everything to pieces because it's smart. It tends to want to analyze it to understand everything. But if it's unconscious or if it's afflicted, so-called in the chart, it absolutely can behave that way and seem very controlling.
Good. All right. So add that. Now, I called up a chart and I wanted you to tell your story. Tell on yourself here, because Robert Glasscock has Capricorn rising and Saturn and Pluto in the seventh house. So how has that experience worked out in your own life?
No comment. That's controlling, isn't it? No comment.
We're both single. We both have Saturn in the seventh.
Well, it is very true. In especially when I was younger, with Saturn in the seventh, I did like to be in control in relationships. And Pluto in the eighth. We're not going to go into this in great detail because if this is not the National Enquirer, but those two planets there are absolutely I have Venus in Scorpio, you see. So where you have planets in Scorpio or Capricorn, you will also tend to want to be in control in those areas as well. And I have Venus in Scorpio, which is love, but it's also in my 10th house of career. And I've always been in control of my career. I've always worked for myself. I've always followed my bliss because that is Venus, and Venus rules my 5th house of bliss and creativity and hobbies and so on. But Venus in Scorpio is very controlling, and it's also Scorpio and Pluto are very unconscious. So I was not aware of that.
Let me go back on one little part that I'd like to clean up, and that is when I mentioned Virgo. Does that mean that we should bring its ruling planet of Mercury into this controlling conversation? Because boy, does that open up some stuff if we do.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think you consider the ruling planet. And, again, I was talking about the 6th house being another area to look at for what Tiffany's calling controlling. And it's the natural house of Virgo and the natural wheel. And that kind of controlling is far more manipulative as a rule than Saturn or Pluto. It's more, Virgo is a mutable sign. So that kind of control instinct goes along much more with gaslighting. You see what I mean?
Through
and
words.
Criticizing other people to put them down and undermine them in very subtle ways. Are you serious? You're going to wear that dress? You see what I mean? That's a way to undermine people and it's a form of control that's not nearly as overt as, say, the Saturn kind of control can be.
Yeah.
The Pluto kind of control is devastating.
How so?
Well, it's unconscious and it really cuts to the quick. I mean, Pluto rules life and death and rebirth. So the kind of control that Pluto indicates is often chronic, for one thing, and very subtle and insidious. But it goes to the heart of people. It's not controlling, say, are you going to wear that dress tonight? It's more like, you always wear the wrong thing. That's devastating. As opposed to, are you going to wear that dress? Maybe you should think about it not. And if you feel that way about your wife's dress, you can say, honey, are you sure that's really appropriate for this group we're going to go to tonight? Maybe you want to rethink. You can do that. But to say, once again, every time you get dressed, you choose the wrong thing. That's a whole value judgment that Pluto imposes, and it's devastating. It's very hurtful and destructive. There's nothing constructive about it. I hope these are the bad examples, but that's what comes to mind.
I think this is hugely valuable. It is truly hugely valuable. Now, I put your chart up, and we talked about you for a minute. Let's tell on me, too. Fair is fair here. So I have, speaking of, Pluto in Virgo in the third house of communication. Okay, that's one. Ding. I have Mars, Neptune, and Sun, my Martian tune, infamously at 6 degrees, all at the same. They are one in the same in Scorpio. Ding, number 2. And I have Saturn in Capricorn in the 7th house. Ding, number 3. So, and Mercury is in Sagittarius and is conjunct Jupiter. So anything controlling via Mercury, which of course rules that Pluto, is going to be magnified. So should I just check out now? Take myself up to
maybe you and I could both use psychiatric intervention.
I was going to say, go find the closest padded walled facility and just turn myself in.
But you can look at the positive sides of those things too, Thomas. Look at you with Pluto and Virgo and the kind of mind that you have metaphysically and spiritually and astrologically. And the idea, because you're a terrific astrologer and you pursue it with a great deal of depth and analytical quality. And the squares to Mercury and Jupiter, the squares are hard aspects, are simply actions. Yeah, they may be conflicts, and certainly we know that you've lived through some recently, but Pluto square Mercury, Jupiter, it gives you this tremendous, it exaggerates your communicative skills, Mercury and Jupiter. That's your whole life in broadcasting, for example. But even as an astrologer, or what we're doing here on these podcasts, this is educational. We're making people think. I hope we are. So that's a very positive side of that Mercury, Jupiter square Pluto aspect.
Yeah, but I can be overly controlling.
Well, so can I, until I turned into a saint.
And then the Scorpio, that's just a whole lot of energy in Scorpio, which was one of the two on your initial list.
But again, take into account those Scorpio planets sextile Pluto in Virgo.
Right.
And that's a big, big help. Believe me, if you had that sun, what do you call it, Mars and Tune?
Mars and Tune, yeah.
If you had that Mars, Neptune, Sun conjunction square Pluto, we probably wouldn't be talking.
Yeah, true. Yeah, I probably wouldn't be alive. Wouldn't have made it to 65.
Thank God we can laugh at this, which is another crucial thing in horoscopes, is a sense of humor about yourself mainly.
Well, it is, and it's stuff that, as you said about your own chart, I'm aware of, and I'm looking into those areas and always pinching myself somewhere every day. How am I being in this situation? And that's part of this is, like you say, when you see difficult aspects like this, you wake up to them, and that's the part of astrology that's so beautiful.
I totally agree. To me, that is the whole purpose of astrology.
Right.
A whole different approach.
Yeah. Hey, I'd like to ask one other question. I'm kind of reading into this, maybe, I don't know, but let's say that somebody is in a controlling relationship with a partner. Can you put their chart and your chart together and take a look at where those controlling areas might show up? How would that work on kind of a synastry kind of thing?
Well, there's an interesting kind of chart, a composite chart, kind of formed by a guy named Ronald Davison, a British astrologer back in the 60s, I guess. It's called a space-time chart. There are different ways to do these composites. The space-time chart is astronomical. The other kinds of composite charts are not. What he does is take the birth data, the date and time and place, the latitude and longitude of one partner, and the date, time, and place of the other partner. And you can do this with a computer. And you calculate the midpoints of all those, the midpoints between the dates, the midpoints between the times, the midpoints between the geographical coordinates, and you get an astronomical chart, which synthesizes those two charts into one. And it's phenomenal as far as the insights go.
And then read it exactly like what you were talking about. Where is Saturn?
Yeah.
Where is Capricorn?
It's like a natal chart for the relationship. It's called the Davison Space-Time Midpoint Chart.
Well, Tiffany, I hope that helps fix you up for controlling issues in the relationships in your own life. And what a great lesson. Robert, thank you so much for that. You know, our show notes are stacked, and for those of you on YouTube, it's the description on YouTube, and we would point you there for all the other information that you need, including Robert's email, where you can book with him directly if you'd like a reading. Thank you guys so much for listening. We will see you next time on the Old Soul, New Soul Astrology Podcast.